The annual Hayes Dynamics summer cookout was crowded that afternoon, hundreds of employees scattered across the company lawn under a flat July sun. Caleb Foster, a single father in his 30s, who managed the engineering team, was mid-laugh when the CEO crossed the grass toward him. Without a word, Lauren Hayes reached up and wiped a smear of barbecue sauce from his cheek in front of everyone. "Careful," Caleb joked. "People will think we're dating." Lauren held his eyes and smiled. "I hope they do." The lawn went silent, and Caleb felt something far worse than embarrassment. What if she meant it? Caleb Foster had built his life around the kind of order that engineering rewarded. He arrived early, left late, and kept his desk arranged so that anyone glancing at it could read exactly what he was working on and nothing about who he was. The marriage that had ended years earlier had taught him that lesson the hard way, and he had taken it to heart. He poured everything into the systems he managed at Hayes Dynamics, and he kept the private part of himself shut away, even from the people who worked beside him every day. The company occupied 4 floors of a glass tower downtown, and the engineering team sat near the top, where the windows turned gold in the late afternoon. Caleb had been there long enough to remember when the firm was half its current size, long enough to have watched it grow into something that mattered in the industry. He liked the work, and he was good at it, and for a long time that had been enough to fill the hours and quiet the questions he never let himself ask out loud. Lauren Hayes ran the place, and she ran it well. She was younger than most of the executives who reported to her, and she had spent the early part of her tenure proving that the name on the building was not the only reason she sat in the corner office. People respected her, which was rarer than people liking her, and Caleb had respected her from the first project they shared. He told himself that was the entirety of it, and for a while he believed it. They worked together often, more often than the org chart strictly required. When a critical launch needed steady hands, Lauren asked for Caleb's team by name. When a vendor relationship went sideways, she pulled him into the room because she said he was the only one who explained hard problems without making people feel stupid. He took these as professional compliments and filed them accordingly, because the alternative was a thought he had no intention of entertaining. What he noticed when he allowed himself to notice anything was the way she listened. In meetings where everyone else waited for their turn to talk, Lauren actually heard him out, following his reasoning to the end before she responded. He assumed she did this with everyone. It was easier to assume that than to wonder why she leaned in a little further when it was his voice in the room, or why her questions to him always seemed to be about him, and not only about the work. The summer cookout was a Hayes Dynamics tradition, held every July in the same public park near the river, the one with the long lawn and the pavilion the company rented out for the day. Hundreds of employees came with families and folding chairs, and the executives flipped burgers at the grills to show they were ordinary people once a year. Caleb usually stayed for an hour, made the necessary rounds, and slipped out before the heat broke. He had planned to do the same that afternoon. He was standing near the food tables with a paper plate and a half-eaten sandwich when one of the junior engineers said something genuinely funny, and Caleb laughed before he could stop himself. It was a real laugh, the kind he rarely let out at work, and in the middle of it, he felt the warm weight of attention shift toward him. Lauren was crossing the grass, and she was looking only at him. She came right up to him in front of the food tables and the crowd that had gathered near them, and without a word, she reached up and brushed her thumb across his cheek, wiping away a smear of barbecue sauce he had not known was there. The gesture was small and absurdly intimate, the kind of thing you did for someone you knew well, and it landed in the middle of a public lawn where everyone could see. "Careful," Caleb said, reaching for the only defense he had, which was a joke. "People will think we're dating." He expected her to laugh and step back to let the moment dissolve into the ordinary noise of the afternoon. Instead, Lauren held his gaze, and there was no joke anywhere on her face. "I hope they do," she said, and she said it plainly the way she said things she meant. The lawn around them went quiet. Caleb heard the river behind the trees, and the distant hiss of a grill, and nothing else, because the dozen people closest to them had stopped talking all at once. He felt heat climb his neck, and the embarrassment was bad, but the embarrassment was not the worst of it. The worst of it was the cold drop in his stomach that came with a single thought he could not push away. What if she was not playing? He managed something a half smile and a few words. He forgot the instant he said them, and the moment broke. Conversations resumed slower than before, and someone turned the music back up. Lauren gave him one more look, unreadable now, and let herself be pulled away by a department head who needed her attention. Caleb stood with his paper plate and the certainty that the afternoon had become something he did not know how to undo. He left the park earlier than he had planned, and he drove home with the windows down and the radio off, replaying 4 words on a loop. I hope they do. He kept trying to fit them into the shape of a joke, a deflection, a CEO, being charming in front of her people, and they kept refusing to fit. Lauren did not do things by accident. He had watched her run rooms full of difficult men for 2 years, and he had never once seen her say something she had not decided to say. That night, he did not sleep so much as wait for morning. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it had been quiet for a long time, and for the first time in years, that quiet felt like a question rather than an answer. He lay in the dark and did the thing he had spent the drive home avoiding, which was to look back honestly at the months and the years behind him, and to ask what they actually added up to. He remembered the late night 2 winters ago when a server migration went catastrophically wrong, and how Lauren had stayed in the office until 3 in the morning, with his team not managing them, just sitting on the floor by his desk, with bad coffee keeping them company while they fixed it. He had thought at the time that she was a good leader. Now he wondered why the CEO of the company had chosen to spend the worst night of his quarter on the floor beside him. He remembered the promotion he had nearly turned down, because it meant more travel than he wanted, and how the role had quietly been redesigned a week later, so the travel disappeared. No one had ever told him she had done it. He had assumed it was a scheduling fluke. He remembered every important project of the last 2 years, and realized with the slow discomfort of a man recalculating a sum he thought he had finished, that his name was on almost all of them, and that the person who kept writing it, there was always the same. There was the way she remembered things he had said in passing, weeks later, when he had forgotten saying them. There was 100 small things he had explained to himself, one at a time, each one harmless on its own, and only now, laid end to end in the dark, did they form a line that pointed somewhere he had refused to look. He had been so committed to not seeing it that he had built an entire private theory of professional respect to avoid the simpler explanation. By morning, he understood that he was standing at a fork and that he could not stand there much longer. One path was the comfortable one, the one he had already half-talked himself onto during the drive home. On that path, what happened at the cookout was a momentary lapse, a flash of impulse from a woman under pressure, the sort of thing 2 professionals could agree to forget. He could walk into the office, keep his head down, and let the whole thing evaporate. It would be the safe choice, and the easy one, and a part of him wanted it badly. The other path frightened him, in a way he had not been frightened in years. On that path, Lauren Hayes had meant exactly what she said, had meant it for a long time, and had finally let it slip out, where he could no longer pretend not to hear. On that path, the woman who ran the company he worked for was in love with him, and had been quietly arranging her life around that fact, while he filed her kindness under the wrong heading. He did not know which possibility scared him more, the one where she had not meant it, or the one where she had. He went to work because there was nothing else to do, and the building felt different the moment the elevator doors opened. People looked at him, and then looked away, and the looking was not hostile, only curious, the kind of curiosity that travels through an office faster than any official memo. He understood that the story had already arrived, before he had, that hundreds of people had watched the CEO wipe sauce off his face, and heard what she said after, and that he was now, whether he liked it or not, a subject of conversation in a place where he had spent years being invisible on purpose. He kept his head down and worked, or tried to, and the morning crawled. Twice he caught himself rehearsing what he would say if Lauren appeared at his desk, and twice he abandoned the rehearsal because every version of it sounded either cowardly or insane. He did not want to be the man who pretended nothing had happened, and he did not have the courage to be the man who asked her what she meant. So he sat in the narrow space between those two men, and he answered emails, and he waited for a thing he could not name. Around noon, a colleague he trusted, a steady older engineer named Marcus Reed, stopped by his desk with 2 coffees and the careful expression of someone bringing news the recipient might not enjoy. Marcus set 1 cup down without being asked and leaned against the partition. "You doing okay this morning?" he said, and the question carried more weight than its 4 words should have. Caleb said he was fine, which was the answer they both expected, and neither believed. Marcus nodded slowly and looked out at the floor where work was happening and gossip was happening underneath it. "People are talking," Marcus said, not unkindly. "I figured you'd rather hear it from me than catch it sideways. Just be careful. With something like this, it's not only your name in the room. There are people on the board who'd love a reason." Caleb thanked him and meant it, and after Marcus left, he sat with the warning for a long while. He had spent the night thinking about Lauren and about himself, about what was true and what he wanted, and somewhere in all of it, he had managed not to think about the obvious thing, which was that she had said it in public. Whatever this was, it was no longer private. It belonged now to the whole building, to a company with shareholders and a board and reputations more fragile than they looked, and to a woman who had a great deal more to lose than he did. That was the thought that finally tipped him, though not in the direction he expected. He had spent years protecting himself by feeling nothing, by keeping the private door shut, by treating his own heart as a liability to be managed. And here was Lauren, who had everything to protect, and had said the dangerous thing anyway in daylight, in front of everyone with her name on the building. She had been braver in 4 words than he had been in years. He did not decide exactly to believe her. It was less a decision than the quiet collapse of his ability to keep not believing her. The theory of professional respect would not hold any longer, not after the cookout, not after a night spent recounting every moment that had never quite fit it. Somewhere between the coffee going cold and the afternoon light starting to slant across the floor, Caleb stopped pretending he did not understand what had been happening and let himself begin to accept the possibility he had been running from since she touched his face. It did not make him happy. Acceptance was not the same as relief. If Lauren meant it, then he was standing at the edge of something with no map and no safe way down something that could cost her the company and cost him the only stable thing he had left. But the alternative, the comfortable lie, had finally become more exhausting to maintain than the truth. He could no longer afford the energy it took to not know what he knew. He looked across the floor toward the corner office where the blinds were half drawn, and Lauren was visible only as a silhouette bent over a desk. He thought about walking over there and saying something, anything, and he did not move. He was not ready, and he doubted he would be ready for a long time, and the doubt itself told him how far he had already traveled from the man who had arrived that morning intending to forget. For 2 years, he had told himself a story in which he was a private man, doing good work for a leader who valued him, and in which nothing underneath that arrangement needed examining. The story had been comfortable precisely because it asked nothing of him. Now the story was gone, dismantled by 4 words on a sunlit lawn, and in its place was a question he could feel in his chest, like a held breath. He did not know the answer yet. He only knew that he had finally, against every instinct he owned, agreed to ask it. The afternoon ended, the way ordinary afternoons do, with the floor emptying out and the light going from gold to gray. Caleb shut down his machine and rode the elevator down with two people who stopped talking when he stepped in. He drove home through the early evening, and this time the radio stayed on low, and he did not replay her words because he no longer needed to. They had moved from the surface of his mind into something deeper and harder to dislodge, and he knew that whatever came next, he was not going to be able to go back to the man he had been at the start of that summer. Something had changed, and he had let it, and the only thing left to find out was what it would cost. The talk did not fade the way office gossip usually faded. By the end of the first week, it had hardened into something with a shape, a story people told each other in lowered voices near the coffee machines and in the stairwells where the cameras did not reach. Caleb felt it follow him down hallways and settle over meetings, and he learned to recognize the particular silence that fell when he walked into a room where his name had been hanging in the air a second earlier. What surprised him was how quickly the story turned away from Lauren and onto him. He had expected the curiosity to land on the CEO, on the woman who had said the dangerous thing in daylight. Instead, it bent toward the simpler and uglier explanation, the one that did not require anyone to believe a powerful woman might be in love. The version that traveled the building was that Caleb Foster had found a way to make himself useful to the boss, and that the cookout had merely shown everyone what he had been quietly trading on for 2 years. He heard it indirectly at first, in the way certain managers stopped including him in conversations they used to pull him into, in the way a few of his own engineers grew careful around him, as though his standing had become a thing that might rub off. Then he heard it directly from a senior director named Howard Bishop, who cornered him after a planning session and said, with the false friendliness of a man delivering a threat, that a lot of people were watching how the engineering team's projects got prioritized these days, and that it would be a shame if good work got tangled up in the appearance of favoritism. Caleb said the work spoke for itself, which was true, and which changed nothing. There was something in the way Bishop said it, though, a confidence too large for a single director, as if he were carrying a message rather than an opinion of his own. Caleb filed it away without knowing what it meant. He understood the math of the situation better than Bishop thought he did. Every project Lauren had ever handed him, every role she had quietly reshaped, every time she had chosen his team by name. All of it now read backward as evidence. The very history that had made him good at his job had been recast as the record of a man being favored, and there was no way to defend himself without making it worse. It got worse when the pressure climbed past the directors and reached the board. Caleb did not see this directly, but he felt its weather change the building. Meetings that used to include him were suddenly held without him. A budget approval that should have taken a day stalled for a week. He learned the way people in companies always eventually learned that questions were being asked above him, and that some of the people asking them had decided his presence near the CEO was a problem worth solving. He understood then that he had become a liability to Lauren in the most literal sense. Whatever she felt, whatever he was beginning to feel, back the simple fact of him standing near her now cost her something every single day. The board did not care about the truth of what had happened on the lawn. They cared about the appearance of it, about shareholders and optics, and the long memory of an industry that loved a scandal, and in that calculation Caleb was not a person at all. He was a risk on a balance sheet, and balance sheets did not forgive. Lauren found him on a Tuesday evening after most of the floor had emptied, and she did it the way she did everything, directly and without apology. She appeared at his desk and asked if he had a few minutes, and the question was a formality because they both knew he did. They took the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one with frosted glass, and she closed the door and sat across from him with the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed and then thrown away the rehearsal. "I owe you an explanation," Lauren said, "and an apology in whatever order you'll let me give them. I never meant to put you in the middle of this. I meant what I said at the park. I just never meant for it to land on you like a verdict." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath the steadiness that Caleb had never heard from her before, and it took him a moment to recognize it as fear. He started to say something about the work, about appearances, about how they could manage the perception, and she stopped him gently. "I'm not talking about the work," she said. "I've been in love with you for a long time, Caleb, longer than is reasonable. And I kept it to myself because I told myself it was the responsible thing, because I have a building with my name on it, and you have a career you built yourself. And the last thing I wanted was to be the reason anyone ever questioned a single thing you earned." Caleb sat with that, and the room felt very small. He had spent the better part of 2 weeks living with the possibility that she might mean it, and hearing her say it out loud was still a different order of thing entirely. Everything he had reassembled in the dark, the server migration, and the redesigned role, and the 100 small kindnesses, all of it clicked into a single picture, and the picture was not a CEO managing her image. It was a woman who had been protecting him from the consequences of her own heart for 2 years without ever once asking him for anything. "I kept my distance on purpose," she went on. "I thought if I never said it, I could give you everything I wanted to give you without it ever costing you. The good projects, the room to grow, all of it. I thought I was being careful." A short, unhappy, almost laugh escaped her. "And then you had barbecue sauce on your face, and I'm tired of being careful, Caleb. I've been careful my whole life." He believed her. That was the thing he kept returning to afterward, that there had been no part of him that doubted her, because nothing about Lauren had ever been performance. He believed her, and the believing did not solve anything. It only raised the stakes of every problem that already surrounded them, because now the gossip and the board and Howard Bishop's smiling threats were not obstacles between him and a misunderstanding. They were obstacles between him and something he was no longer sure he could walk away from. That was when she told him the rest, and the rest changed the shape of everything. The board had convened over the matter quietly and seriously, and they had given her a condition. If she wanted to keep her position, she was to end any personal relationship with any employee immediately and permanently, and to do so in a way that put the question to rest for good. They had framed it as a governance issue, a matter of protecting the company, and they had made it clear that her continued tenure as chief executive depended on her compliance. "It was Gerald Pierce who pushed it through," Lauren said, and there was a weariness in the name. "He's been on the board longer than I've run the place, and he's never forgiven the company for choosing me. Bishop and a few of the directors follow his lead. Pierce found a cause he could dress up as principal, and he ran with it." Caleb understood, listening to her, that the story had stopped being about feelings somewhere in the last 2 weeks and become about power. Pierce was not interested in whether Lauren loved him. He was interested in whether her loving him gave him leverage, and he had the patience to use it. "I'm telling you all of this," Lauren said, "not because I want you to fix it. There's nothing for you to fix. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's actually happening, and because I'm done deciding things about your life without letting you in the room." She looked at him with an openness that cost her something, a CEO who had spent years never letting anyone see the price of her decisions, and Caleb felt the full weight of what she was handing him. He went home that night with a different kind of sleeplessness than before. The first time weeks ago, the question had been whether she meant it. That question was answered now, and in its place was a worse one. He loved her, or was close enough to loving her, that the distinction no longer mattered, and the simple fact of that love was a threat to the thing she had spent her life building. Every hour he stayed close to her was an hour Pierce could use against her. He could not be both the man who loved Lauren Hayes and the man who protected her. The two were now in direct opposition, so he made the choice that felt in the moment like the only honorable one available. He decided to step back. Not to tell her not to make a speech about sacrifice, but simply to put distance between them, the kind of clean, professional distance that would let Pierce's argument answer itself. If there was nothing to see, the watching would eventually stop, and the leverage would dissolve, and Lauren would keep the company she had earned. He told himself it was the brave thing, the selfless thing, and only later would he understand how much of it was also the old reflex, the safety of feeling less. He began declining the meetings he could decline, and finding reasons to be elsewhere when their paths would have crossed. When a new project came up that would have naturally been his, he suggested another lead, citing bandwidth, and watched Lauren's face go carefully blank as she approved it. He was polite and professional and utterly unavailable, and he kept it up for days, telling himself each morning that he was saving her, that the ache of it was the cost of doing right. What he had not accounted for was how it would look from her side. He had decided in the privacy of his own head that withdrawal was protection. But he had not told her that because telling her would have meant a conversation, and the conversation would have meant standing close to the very feelings he was trying to retreat from. So Lauren experienced none of his reasoning and all of his absence. She had opened herself, completely told him the truth, at real risk to herself, and watched the man she loved respond by quietly disappearing from her days. He saw what it was doing to her, and that was the worst part because he could not explain without undoing the whole strategy. He caught her watching him across the floor with an expression that had gone from open to guarded to something colder, and he understood that she had drawn the only conclusion the evidence supported. From where Lauren stood, Caleb had heard her say she loved him and had decided he did not believe her, or did not want her, or was not willing to risk anything for her. His silence meant as a shield read to her as a verdict, and there was no way to correct it that did not require the closeness he was avoiding. The distance between them, which he had created on purpose to save her, became a real distance, the kind that does not close on its own. They stopped speaking, except about work, and even that grew formal and thin. The building, which had spent 2 weeks watching them, began to relax, satisfied that whatever had flared at the cookout had burned out. And Caleb told himself this was exactly what he had wanted, while a part of him he had thought long dead ached at the sight of her turning away. He had nearly convinced himself it was working when the thing he had not seen coming arrived, and it arrived in the form of a problem with his own work. An internal review flagged a series of approvals on one of his past projects, approvals that appeared on paper to show Caleb receiving authorizations and resources that had been signed off outside the normal process. The documentation suggested that he had been granted privileges no one at his level should have had, and that the authorizations traced back to the CEO's office. He knew the instant he saw the flagged records that he had never requested or received any such thing. The approvals were real documents in the system, but the story they told was false, and someone had built that story deliberately. The paper trail was clean and damning, and exactly the kind of thing the board's harshest members had been looking for, a concrete piece of evidence that the relationship everyone suspected had translated into actual misconduct, actual favors, changing hands. It was no longer a matter of appearances. It was now on the record a matter of wrongdoing. The speed of it told him it was no accident. The records had surfaced at precisely the moment they would do the most damage in precisely the form the board most needed, and Caleb did not believe in that kind of luck. He thought about Bishop's confidence, that message-carrying tone, and about Pierce standing behind him, and he understood that he had walked into something engineered. But understanding it and proving it were different things, and proof was not what the moment allowed. He was suspended within the day, escorted through the process, with the cold efficiency companies reserved for liabilities, his access cut back, and his projects reassigned. The official language was careful and temporary pending review, but everyone understood what a suspension meant. He had gone in the space of an afternoon from a respected lead to a man under investigation, and the story the building now told about him was the worst possible version of the one it had been telling for weeks. And it did not stop with him. The same records that damned Caleb implicated Lauren, because the authorizations traced to her office and the board now had exactly what Pierce had wanted from the start. The condition they had set, the demand that she end the relationship, had been a warning. This was the consequence. With documented misconduct on the table, Lauren's position was no longer merely awkward. It was untenable, and the shareholders who had been merely uneasy were now openly alarmed, and the talk above Caleb's head had turned from whether to manage her to whether to remove her. Caleb sat in his quiet apartment that night and saw the full shape of what had happened. He had stepped back to protect Lauren, and his stepping back had not protected her at all. Pierce had moved anyway with manufactured evidence, and now they were both standing in the wreckage, her career and his reputation tangled together in a story neither of them had written. His sacrifice had bought nothing. The distance he had built had not saved her, and the silence he had kept had wounded her. And now a lie was doing what the truth never could have, tearing down everything either of them had built. He thought sitting there that the only thing left he could give her was his absence, the complete and permanent kind. If he resigned, if he left the company and the city behind, perhaps the scandal would lose its center, and her position could be salvaged. It was the same logic that had driven him to step back, scaled up to its final form, and it was wrong in exactly the same way. But he could not see that yet. All he could see was the woman he loved, standing at the edge of losing everything because she had been brave enough to wipe sauce off his face in front of the world, and his own helplessness to stop it. The story had stopped being theirs entirely. It belonged now to the man who had built the lie, and Caleb had only begun to understand how far that man would go. The resignation letter sat finished on Caleb's screen for 2 days before he could make himself look at it without flinching. It was short the way he believed these things should be. No explanations, and no blame, just a date and a signature, and the clean exit he had decided was the last gift he could give her. He had already begun the quiet work of calling a contact in another city about a position pricing out a one-way move, treating his whole life as a liability to be packed and removed. He told himself the logic held. If he was gone, the scandal lost its body. There would be no employee for the board to point at, no relationship to police, no convenient villain in the engineering department for the manufactured records to convict. Lauren would still face the fallout, but she would face it without him hanging around her neck, and perhaps that was enough. He had stepped back to protect her, and it had failed. So now he would step all the way out, and this time the distance would be too great for anyone to close, including himself. Across the city in rooms Caleb had never been allowed to enter, Lauren was preparing for a meeting that would decide whether the company still belonged to her. The board had scheduled a special session, and the agenda was not hidden. With documented misconduct on the table and shareholders demanding answers, Pierce and the directors who followed him finally had the footing to move. She would walk into that room as the chief executive, and there was no guarantee she would walk out as one, and everyone involved knew it. She did not call Caleb. He understood why. From where she stood, he had answered her honesty with silence and her crisis with retreat. And now he was a man under investigation who had stopped speaking to her entirely. She had no way of knowing that his silence had been a misguided shield, and he had given her no reason to believe anything but the worst. So she prepared alone the way she had done everything alone, and Caleb sat with his finished letter and the knowledge that they were both about to lose the thing that mattered most in separate rooms without a single honest word between them. It was Marcus Reed who broke the silence the same night the letter was ready to send. He showed up at Caleb's door unannounced, with the same careful expression he had worn weeks earlier over 2 cups of coffee. "The board meets Thursday morning," Marcus said. "Special session. They're going to vote her out and pin the whole thing on the 2 of you. I figured you'd want to know, because the way it's headed, nobody in that room is going to speak for either of you." Then he said the thing that changed the night. "Those records they're using. I've worked here long enough to know what real approvals look like, Caleb. Those aren't right. They're too clean." The words landed on something Caleb had been circling without letting himself touch. He had spent his entire career inside systems like these, and he knew the difference between the mess, real work left behind, and the tidiness of something built to be found. The approvals that damned him were too perfect, too conveniently routed, surfaced at too precise a moment. A man preparing to flee does not usually look closely at the thing chasing him, but the engineer in him refused to leave a false thing unexamined, and Marcus had just given him a reason to stop running. So instead of sending the letter, he opened the records one more time and read them the way he would read a system that was lying to him. He still had the narrow access a suspended employee retains for a few days before it is fully revoked, and he used what he had carefully and quickly with Marcus on the phone as a second pair of eyes. He followed the authorizations backward, not where they claimed to originate, but where they had actually been entered, tracing the timestamps and the access logs beneath the surface of the documents, the metadata no one had bothered to scrub because no one expected the accused to look there. What he found turned the floor of his stomach to ice. The approvals had not come from Lauren's office at all. They had been entered through it, made to appear as though they originated there. But the actual point of access traced to a different account entirely, one belonging to Gerald Pierce. The entries had been made late outside business hours by someone who knew the systems well enough to route the surface through the CEO's office, but who had treated the underlying logs as beneath his notice, the way men who give orders rarely think about the trail their own hands leave. Pierce had never imagined that a suspended engineer stripped of his standing and halfway out the door would be the one to read the layer he had ignored. It was Pierce, and the picture finally resolved. The man had watched the cookout and the gossip, the way a patient predator watches weather, and he had seen in two people's feelings the opening he had been waiting for. The condition the board imposed on Lauren had been the first move Bishop and the others, applying the pressure Pierce designed. The manufactured records had been the second, meant to convert mere suspicion into documented misconduct, to make Lauren's position untenable and force her out so that Pierce could move into the vacuum and take the control of the company he had wanted all along. Caleb had not been collateral damage. He had been the instrument, the convenient man near the CEO, whose closeness made the lie believable. He worked through that night with a focus he had not felt in years, the resignation letter closed and forgotten. He pulled the access logs and the timestamps and the routing data, the technical proof that the approvals were forgeries entered by Pierce's account, and he assembled it into something a room full of non-engineers could understand. He did not make speeches to himself about courage. He simply did the work the way he always had, except that this time the system he was fixing was the one trying to destroy the woman he loved, and the flaw he had found was a man. He understood as the file came together that he had been wrong about everything that mattered. He had thought the brave thing was to step back, to disappear, to protect Lauren by absenting himself, and all of it had been the old reflex wearing the costume of sacrifice. The retreat had never been protection. It had been fear, and his fear had nearly let a liar win. The actual brave thing, the thing Lauren had done on a sunlit lawn weeks ago, was to stay to speak, to stand in the open and tell the truth, and let it cost what it cost. He had spent his retreat learning the lesson she had tried to teach him with 4 words. The board session convened on a gray Thursday morning in the largest conference room on the executive floor. The directors arranged around a long table with the major shareholders present, and Lauren at the head of it, composed and alone. Caleb did not have an invitation and did not wait for one. He walked through the building that had spent weeks deciding he was a man who traded on favors, past the people who looked and looked away, and he opened the door to the room where his life and hers were being decided, and he did not knock. The conversation stopped. Gerald Pierce, mid-sentence, looked at him with the particular irritation of a man whose script has been interrupted, and Bishop began to say that this was a closed session. Caleb spoke over all of it, because he had learned at last that there were moments distance could not survive. "Before you vote on anything," he said, setting the file on the table. You should know who actually entered those approvals, because it wasn't her office, it was his account. He looked at Pierce when he said it. He did not raise his voice. He laid out the proof the way he had spent his career laying out hard problems, plainly and in order, so that even the people in the room, who could not read a log file, could follow the line of it. The approvals that supposedly proved his misconduct had been entered late at night, routed to appear as though they came from the CEO's office, but originating from Gerald Pierce's own access. He showed them the timestamps. He showed them the routing. He showed them the one layer beneath the forged surface that Pierce had never expected anyone to examine. The room turned slowly, and then, all at once, toward Pierce. The man's composure held for a few seconds, and then began to come apart in the small ways composure does, a tightening at the jaw, a glance toward the door, a denial that arrived a half-beat too late to be believed. He called it a fabrication, called Caleb, a desperate man inventing a story to save himself, and he looked to Bishop for support. But Bishop had gone very still, the way a man does when he realizes the cause he carried for someone else has just become a thing he might have to answer for. The evidence was on the table now, technical and dated and traceable, and the directors who had been ready to remove Lauren were already reading it, with the cold attention of people recalculating where the danger actually lay. The truth, once it was in the open, did not need Caleb to argue it further. The board ordered the records independently verified that same morning, and the verification confirmed everything he had shown them. The authorizations were forgeries. They had been entered through Pierce's account. The man who had spent weeks engineering Lauren's downfall had built his entire scheme on the assumption that no one would look beneath the surface of the documents, and the one person in the building who could not help looking had been the very man he chose to frame. Caleb was cleared. The suspension was lifted before the meeting ended. The investigation against him collapsed for lack of anything real to investigate, and the story the building had told about him for weeks reversed itself in the span of a single morning. Gerald Pierce was removed from the board and referred to the kind of proceedings that follow when a man forges records to seize a company, and Bishop, exposed as the instrument of a scheme he had been too eager to serve, was quietly stripped of his standing along with him. The directors who had nearly done Pierce's work for him were left to sit with how close they had come to handing him exactly what he wanted. Lauren kept the company. The condition the board had imposed dissolved, along with the lie that had given it teeth, because there had never been misconduct. Only feelings, and feelings were not a crime, no matter how badly Pierce had needed them to be one. She sat at the head of the table as the room reordered itself around the truth, and Caleb watched the fear he had heard in her voice weeks ago finally leave her face. And he understood that she had walked into that room prepared to lose everything, and was walking out with it intact. There was one more thing to do, and for the first time in his life, Caleb did it without retreating from it. The room was still full, the directors and the shareholders, all present, the exact public he had spent 2 years hiding from, and he turned to Lauren in front of all of them and said the thing he had been too afraid to say in private. "I stepped back because I thought it would protect you," he said. "I was wrong. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself the way I always have. I love you. I should have said it the day you wiped sauce off my face, and I'm saying it now in front of everyone because you were brave enough to and I wasn't." It was not a polished speech, and he did not want it to be. He had spent his retreat learning that the open thing was the only honest thing, and he said it openly to the woman who had risked her company for him, and to the room that had spent weeks deciding who he was. Lauren looked at him across the long table, and whatever she had been bracing against for weeks gave way, and the answer was on her face before she said a word. The distance he had built and called protection had finally, fully closed, and this time neither of them was going to let it open again. The months that followed put the company back together, and more slowly put the two of them back together as well. The investigation ran its course, and the verdicts landed where they belonged. The story the building told changed for good. No longer about a man who traded on favors, but about a man who had refused to leave a false thing unexamined, even when leaving would have been easier. Caleb went back to the work he was good at, and Lauren ran the company she had earned, and the thing between them stopped being a secret because there was no longer any reason for it to be one. When summer came around again, the company held its cookout in the same park near the river, the same long lawn, and the same rented pavilion, the same flat afternoon sun. Hundreds of employees came as they always did, and the grills smoked, and the music played, and for most of the people there, it was simply another company tradition. For two of them, it was the place where everything had started. The lawn where a CEO had wiped barbecue sauce off an engineer's cheek and told the truth in 4 words while the whole company watched. Caleb and Lauren arrived together, and Marcus Reed was among the first to find them lifting a paper cup in a small, dry salute to the 2 people he had refused to let go down quietly. No one pretended not to notice them, because there was nothing left to pretend about. The gossip that had once followed them down hallways had long since burned out, replaced by something closer to goodwill. The quiet approval of people who had watched 2 of their own come through a thing that should have destroyed them both. The difference in their titles, which had once felt like a wall the whole world was determined to police, had become simply a fact about where they sat at work, and nothing about who they were to each other. Someone near the food tables, a junior engineer who had been there the year before, brought up the line the way people bring up the founding story of a thing they were lucky enough to witness. He repeated what Caleb had joked that afternoon, "Careful people will think we're dating," and laughed, and asked if it was really how it had all begun. The small crowd around the tables turned to hear the answer, the same kind of crowd that had gone silent on that exact spot a year before. Caleb looked at Lauren, and there was no fear in it anymore. None of the cold drop in the stomach he had felt the first time, only the steady warmth of a man who had stopped hiding from his own life. He told them that it was true, that he had said it as a joke to cover how rattled he was, and that her answer had changed everything that came after. He told them simply and without flourish that it was the line that had turned his whole life around, because it was the moment someone braver than he was had refused to let him keep pretending. Lauren stood beside him in the summer light, the CEO who had once been careful her whole life and had decided on this lawn to stop, and she let him say it in front of everyone, the way she had said her piece in front of everyone a year before. The crowd took it the way crowds take a good ending, with the easy happiness of people who like to see 2 decent people land somewhere good, and then the music came back up, and the afternoon went on around them. They stayed late this time, long past the hour Caleb used to allow himself before slipping away. The heat broke the way it had the year before, and the river ran quietly beyond the trees, the same river that had been there through every turn of the story. He thought about the man he had been at the start of that first summer, the one who kept the private door shut and called it safety, and he did not miss him. What had stood between them had never really been the difference in their titles, or the money, or the watching eyes of a company that loved a scandal. It had been his own fear of facing what he actually felt, the long habit of feeling less, so he would have less to lose. Lauren had shown him in 4 words on a sunlit lawn that honesty took more courage than silence ever had, and that only by daring to say the true thing out loud did a person get any chance at the best of what a life could offer. They walked out of the park together as the light went gold into the chapter that began the moment he stopped being afraid to want it.